Even then, if there's one accidental death, the history books may say that was the moment things ignited, even if we here in the weeds don't see it as such. No one thought the first Civil War was going to happen. Fort Sumter wasn't even considered the start of the Civil War. The Battle of Fort Sumter, only one person died. It was an accident. After that battle happened, the history books have declared the Civil War hath begun. Except the people of the United States still didn't believe it. And so when it came to the first Battle of Bull Run, they were picnicking. And they're like, there's no Civil War. Nothing's going to happen. And then there was a massacre with, like, there's this famous drawing of the mayor frantically running. It's a drawing because there's no photos. And
today we break down the intense discussion on civil unrest, state sovereignty, and federal authority, and the parallels between America's past and our current political climate. These are conversations no one else is having, and we are not holding back. If you're here to escape the mainstream spin and get some unfiltered opinion, smash that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get into it.
Then people realized we are in and in fact, even at that point, they still didn't call it the Civil War. It wasn't until a couple of years later it started being called a Civil War. It was called a rebellion or war between states or something like this. So in the instance of something happening in Texas, it may be an accident that no one wants to take responsibility for. But even then, if there's one accidental death, the history books may say that was the moment things ignited, even if we here in the weeds don't see it as such. But anyway, I digress. We'll entertain another scenario. Let's say you're completely correct. California. Donald Trump is going to implement massive immigration reforms and deportations. He says he wants to use local police and military now. When I asked him, he said local police. Now he's saying we would use military to a certain degree. What do you think California does if Donald Trump sends in federal authorities to start going door to door, not just ICE, but expanding ICE and ordering local police and sheriffs and National Guard?
This hits a nerve. California sees itself as above the federal law, yet these same leaders love weaponizing federal power when it benefits them. Selective obedience to the law is a dangerous game. Imagine the outrage if a red state defied Biden's order on gun control or lockdowns. Would we call it civil disobedience, or would it be smeared as a rebellion?
I think there's a possibility that it starts here. Trump says we're deporting the illegal immigrants. They're not allowed to be here. They need to be here legally. And so he sends in ICE. California blocks him. Trump says we need the law of the federal government to be enforced. And as such, I am invoking my right to direct the National Guard of California, which the law states, if the law is, the federal law states that if law is not being enforced, the federal government can assume command of the National Guard to enforce the law. So then he says to the California National Guard, you will go to these homes, you will take these illegal immigrants and load them into buses, get them on planes, and send them back to their home countries and processing centers. What if California says no? And then California, the governor, says to the National Guard, do not obey those orders from the federal government. You are California National Guard. You will not obey Donald Trump's fascist Nazi takeover. Is that a possibility?
I mean, it is a possibility, but we already had a situation like this play out in the 60s over integration. And when the National Guard was federalized, the government backed down. And I think they would do the same here. There's too much respect for federal authority. The state, the national state, even compared to the 1860s, is far stronger. And even in that scenario where you're talking about the Civil War, South Carolina had already seceded. So had several other states. And when this was a foreign country firing on the United States at that point. And
Fort Sumter was in South Carolina. So this wasn't.
But it was a United States military installation. So, and South Carolina was no longer in the U.S. or it declared it was no longer in the U.S.
Not according to the Union.
But it had declared itself, and it was another entity firing on the federal government, the U.S.
According to the Union and the federal troops, it was a state-level entity attacking the federal authorities as one country.
But it had already seceded.
South
Carolina already saw itself as a separate country.
But to the Union, there was no such secession. It was
that marked the secession.
No, it didn't. Yeah. The Union never viewed the southern states as having left the United States.
They were fighting to bring them back, but that
no. They did not view them as separate.
Tim is objectively correct here.
The Union never looked at South Carolina.
The Union never saw them, but as actual practice, they were outside of it. But they were fighting to restore them to the Union and bring them back into fully in line with the rest of the Union.
There's an important...
But the war, and everyone knew that war was a strong possibility, and they were trying to avoid a Fort Sumter.
No, this is completely incorrect.
Let me interject.
Nobody knew.
Saw that the war was going to happen when they started seceding.
That's why they were picnicking at Bull Run.
They were picnicking because they thought there would only be one battle, and they weren't.
That's not
aware.
true.
Yes, it was. They were not. When war happened, they thought that war. When the South started seceding, there was this desire to see what would happen. And they were hoping that the South would come back to its senses, that even the seceded states, that they would make these compromises and that they would come back and avoid war. But once Fort Sumter happened and both sides are raising armies and then sending them to Manassas.
They were not raising armies. That is incorrect.
The South was absolutely raising armies. They were using their state militias and using that as Confederate
Okay, we got to pause. That's not true.
Army.
The Lincoln did not mobilize until after Bull Run, and only 7 states had seceded in the first place. It was after Bull Run, the mobilization that Lincoln tried to implement, that sparked 4 more states to secede.
No, it was Fort Sumter prompted the 4 other states to leave. You can look this up. No, it was the 4 other states.
Right, maybe you're correct.
Fort Sumter was that, and Fort Sumter, then they began raising troops.
Yeah, I believe you're correct. I stand corrected. I think you're right.
The draft and conscription, I'm pretty sure that happens after Fort Sumter, but that could have also
What's
been.
the
But
point
they
of
were
contention?
utilizing both sides were utilizing the state militias and what troops they could find and deploying them out in the battlefield.
I stand corrected. You are correct. It was 3 days after Fort Sumter, Lincoln mobilized to send troops.
Yes.
Prompting the secession.
What do you guys? What's your point of contention here?
I guess we're arguing over the original Civil War, so we should go into the future.
No,
The point is that people did not think a war had begun even after Fort Sumter.
Yeah, Tim's right here. I basically completely agree with the things Tim said.
But I was wrong about
What do you mean that a war hadn't begun? Violence had erupted.
nobody died.
People were massively coping.
They were firing cannons. People could easily die. It's not like they're just firing blanks at each other or having a paintball match.
We have a tremendous amount of primary sources from this time period, and Tim is right, where people didn't think the war was happening until way past the point they were already in it. And there was
They didn't think it was going to be a long war. They thought that one battle would solve the whole matter.
But they didn't even call it the Civil War for a couple years.
Yeah, but it was a war. And it was, by the end of 1861, several people had died and everyone knew that this was a war.
So if you look at the Democrat platform and then you look at the various positions the politicians had, there was tremendous coping about the war until pretty far in, where people would say, oh my God, the South's going to back down. It's all the things you just said. The South's just doing this for attention. The South, this isn't a real conflict. This is just a constitutional crisis. And then it kept spiraling and spiraling and spiraling.
That's true. But Fort Sumter was the break that's saying, oh shit, this is.
I'm
something
unclear
serious.
how this relates to the point we're trying to convey, though.
I
was going to say that I agreed with Tim's point that these you have gasoline and then there's a match, and it's unclear what the match is going to be, but there's always has to be a match.
But the match.
This is a critical analogy for today's political climate. Just like Fort Sumter, it's often seemingly minor incident that trigger large-scale conflict. The lesson? We're sitting on a powder keg, and the political elite, media, and even rogue state governments are tossing sparks left and right. From election disputes to federal versus state clashes, it's easy to see parallels with past conflicts, and the danger now is underestimating the sign of escalation, just like Americans did in 1861. Ignoring the warning signs today could mean repeating history.
Can be innocuous.
Exactly.
It can be such a small and mundane thing that under normal circumstances doesn't matter.
Yes.
Let's say you have a rainy fall and a guy starts chucking M80s and is flamethrowering all across California. No wildfire can start. But you get a dry summer and someone can accidentally, maybe they're driving their car and they get a flat tire, their tire rips off and then it scrapes on the ground, sparking, the whole thing goes up.
I'm laughing because the first thought that came into my mind is Mr. Beast making a video. I started a California wildfire.
And his mouth
I started the Civil War in California could maybe be his next video. But even on that, we did, with the conflict between federal and state authority, we did have that in the 50s and 60s over integration, and the federal authority won out. And even the states could call upon mobs of violent young men to side with them, even in the case of and Ole Miss in 62 when they were trying to integrate it. And at Little Rock, they had not just the National Guard and state police, they also had these mobs. And I don't think California would have, the type of imposing mobs they had in Ole Miss and Little Rock aren't going to be the middle-aged cat ladies who are going to come out to prevent people from enforcing a federal immigration law.
So we'll pause here and I'll say, it's interesting to entertain the similarities between 1860, and technically you'd go back through Bleeding Kansas, and you'd even go back to 1820 when they were already discussing civil war. In fact, there was already contention during the signing of the Declaration of Independence over slavery. You look at that, and what you have is sovereign states with a weak federal union, and when they decided the federal union was going to go up against the states, what was stronger, that is not typical of any civil war ever. That is the United States as sovereign states effectively in a large-scale war, which is kind of like more like Europe than anything else. If you take a look at Spain or Russia, a tiny fraction in key areas uses violence to seize control from a rather apathetic general population that doesn't want to be involved. And so what we see here is it may be that it's our bias of 1861 that we say maybe the feds will come into Texas, maybe Trump will try and enforce a mass immigration thing. Then a state like we saw this in 2020 when the Democrats ran a war game where they actually entertained West Coast states seceding from the Union if Donald Trump were to have won in 2020.
This proves that when progressives lose power, they abandon unity. The left accuses conservatives of being dangerous and divisive, but this scenario shows who's truly prepared to walk away from democracy. If we flip this and a red state threatens secession, it'd be called treason. Double standards fuel distrust, and that's what breaks nations.
It was Boston Globe reporting. They literally got like John Podesta was hanging out with these other big uniparty neolibs and neocons being like, okay, if Trump wins, we're going to need Oregon, Washington, California to secede from the Union unless Donald Trump guarantees constitutional reforms and things like this. So that conversation was happening, and it's kind of crazy, but I think it's largely due to our biases that we think that's how things would play out. I think it's entirely possible that what we end up seeing is more like Chaz Chop level times 10 times 100. So we actually had a period in this country where for a few months in the Pacific Northwest, there were autonomous zones set up to the point where they had armed guards. They had taken over a police department, kicked out the local police force, surrounded that, and were in control for a couple of months and actually murdered people, actually killed people. Then you have the Atlanta Autonomous Zone. Same thing. They torched a Wendy's, took it over. People were killed there. There were shootings. Yeah, I know the Wendy's Autonomous Zone is, but you know what's funny is
Wendy's.
It seems crazy to us, but this would be like saying, I don't know, people may get offended by this, but the Alamo. Right, a singular building that's is taken over. Granted, Wendy's is a chain of fast food.
Remember the Wendy's.
So now here's the important thing real quick. The Minnesota George Floyd Autonomous Zone was up for, I think, 2 years.
Damn.
Where George Floyd Square was occupied to the point where there was a guy on a rooftop with a rifle that people had reported seeing all the time, and there was nothing stopping any of these people from taking this territory. Now, we may look, maybe nothing happens. Fair point on the civil rights movement. Many people thought this could lead to a second civil war. There's also, I think it was 1876, where they thought the civil war was going to erupt again. They had the corrupt bargain. It didn't happen. We said, guys, we're not going to let it get that far. But today, what I think is different is we have militant extremist factions that have already taken over portions of cities. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere, or maybe after Trump wins, they flood these cities. If you get...
So we're going to end off today's video. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments below, as always, and be sure to give me a like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.